Hi, and welcome back to our online lecture here on the Mongols. In part one, we talked about Genghis Khan. We talked about Temujin, and we looked at his success, but it would be incomplete of us to only talk about Genghis Khan as we talk about the Mongols. So in part two, we're going to move on past Genghis Khan. We're going to look at Kublai Khan and how he rules China. So the Mongol Empire. Well, Genghis Khan died in 1227 of illness. We don't really know what he died of, but we do know that his empire continued on after his death. So his successors continued to conquer territory, eventually having the largest unified land empire in history. I mentioned that in part one. This is a giant piece of property. And not to take anything away from the Mongols, but if we looked at that geographically today, there's a large sections of this empire where even in 2019 people don't live there. Now, I'm not trying to belittle what Genghis Khan and the Mongols did, but there are large segments in Asia that are mostly uninhabited. It's worth mentioning that if you want to do some comparisons in history. But either way, largest unified land empire in history. His successors divided the region up into four different territories called khanates, and this is just smart. We've learned this. We have 50 different territories in the United States. When empires or territories just get too large, they become very difficult to govern. Breaking them up makes that a lot easier. Now, you have to remember, the Mongols, as they expanded, really did not always treat people well. So they destroyed villages, they destroyed irrigation channels, and decimated populations along the way. Part of that is because that was their lifestyle, but part of that was is to send a message to the next enemy that you don't want to mess with the Mongols. So here is what the Mongol Empire will eventually look like. Again, Genghis Khan did not have China, but his successors will. And so we're going to talk about that here with our next ruler, Kublai Khan. Here's just a look at the empire with the four khanates. So you had four different regions here that were controlled by a different Khan to help govern the large territory that the Mongols had. Now, talking about how they ruled, they rarely imposed their beliefs on conquered peoples. The Mongols could not read or write, and so learning language or using language from the people that they conquered was an important thing that they did. They often used medicine from Chinese doctors. So in one regard, we can talk about how the Mongols were positive to the people that they conquered. So if you were not slaughtered, raped, or murdered by them, chances are pretty good that while they ruled you, things were solid. They weren't awful. So they even adopted some of the culture of those that they ruled. And we saw that a little bit in the video, again, with the written language and the medicine from the Chinese. When you have an empire that size, and when you've got an army and a military that's really ruling things, oftentimes one of the results of that is peace. So this time period where the Mongols ruled Asia was known as the Pax Mongolica, also known as the Mongol Peace. It's a time of peace and prosperity and stability across the Mongol Empire from the mid-1200s to the mid-1300s. Nobody was trying to take out the Mongols. Nobody was fighting each other because the Mongols had such tight control. And when that happens, you have no conflict, which results in peace. Now, we haven't talked about it yet because we haven't gotten to our Rome unit, but Rome actually had a period of time called the Pax Romana, which came quite a bit before this. You have to remember with this unit on China, the Chinese history is 4,000 years old, so we're moving way up into AD periods here. But we'll talk about the Pax Romana, which actually came first when we get to our Roman unit. And it's literally the same thing. The Romans had such tight control over their empire with their military that nobody was picking fights with the Romans, so the result there was peace as well. So Pax Romana, Pax Mongolica, both mean a time of peace. Trade and invention spread during the Pax Mongolica due to safe travel. I mean, if I know I can go from town to town, trading and bartering with other people because the roads are safe, I'm probably going to do it. So that definitely is a benefit here, trade and invention spread. All right, so Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan becomes the next Khan or the next emperor of this territory. So he's the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he took the title of Khan in 1260. And he's going to fulfill the wish of his grandfather. He will conquer all of China. Remember, Genghis Khan wanted to do it, but he died before he was even able to get further into China. So the Mongols conquer. That's what they do. And Kublai Khan continues that trend. So he is going to begin the last of the 5 dynasties that we've been talking about in this unit, the Yuan dynasty, which ruled from 1279 to 1368. So the Yuan dynasty isn't really a Chinese dynasty. It's a Mongol dynasty in China, ruled by the Mongols. So China was united for the first time in 300 years. China goes through different periods like this. We know that Shi Huangdi united the Chinese when he conquered them and took over with the Qin dynasty. But after different dynasties, in between periods, sometimes there's wars, sometimes there's instability. And the Mongols are going to bring back that stability by uniting the Chinese. Even though they're foreign rulers, they're going to unite China for the first time in nearly 300 years. So Kublai Khan's control opened China up to more trade and foreign contact. That's one thing the Chinese have not really done a lot of in their history. They're so isolated geographically that trade became difficult, especially with other cultures. Kublai Khan wanted more trade. He wanted more Europeans to come in, so he definitely encouraged that. One of the things that Kublai Khan was well known for is enjoying the luxuries that China had to offer him, especially as emperor. So he enjoyed living in luxury as Chinese emperor, and that's going to come back to haunt him a little bit later. You go from having essentially nothing. The Mongols did not have palaces. They certainly didn't have a lot of material possessions because they were nomadic and they moved a lot. But now you come to China and you live in a huge palace and you can have all the food and all the pleasures that you can think of. That's a big change for Kublai Khan, and records say that he definitely enjoyed having those luxuries. Now, what Kublai Khan wanted to do is he wanted to sail across the sea and take over Japan. So he attempted to take over Japan, but the Japanese fought back, and ultimately the weather really dealt Kublai Khan a major blow, and it halted his invasion. They called it kamikaze, divine wind, but we would call it a typhoon or a hurricane. Came and wrecked a bunch of Kublai Khan's ships. So Kublai Khan never actually takes over Japan. Genghis Khan wanted to take over China. He did not do so. Kublai Khan wanted to take over Japan. He did not do so. So you have some ambitions there that go unfulfilled by both of those rulers. Kublai Khan improved the Grand Canal, which we saw in Engineering and Empire. He added 135 miles to it. So that's a nice accomplishment that we can attribute to Kublai Khan. So here is the Yuan Empire. Again, it's controlled by the Mongols. Here you can see a green line that shows the Grand Canal connecting the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, and he added 135 miles to it. So Mongol rule in China. Well, the Mongols were hugely outnumbered in China, as you can imagine. Both sides lived apart from one another. To make sure that they wouldn't overthrow the Mongols, the Chinese were not allowed to hold high government office. However, they could serve at local levels. So they didn't keep the Chinese out completely, but they knew if they had them having high office jobs that eventually that could lead to the Chinese reclaiming their land and kicking out the Mongols. But it's kind of cool to note that they let the Chinese still serve at local levels. So high public office, of course, went to the Mongols, but they also gave some of those jobs to foreigners because they felt foreigners could be trusted due to having no loyalties to both the Mongols or the Chinese. Again, this was something Kublai Khan definitely advocated for, having foreigners and traders come in. We know that the Mongol Peace, or the Pax Mongolica, extended trade. And some of the things that traders wanted when they came in, they wanted Chinese silk, they wanted Chinese porcelain. Gunpowder had been developed by this point. Paper currency, the Chinese had invented paper quite a few centuries before. And the compass. So the Chinese were advanced in all sorts of different ways, and these would have been commodities that people would have been able to take back home and sell at a very high price. So, like I said, he invited foreign merchants in, such as Marco Polo. Marco Polo, as you see here, was from Venice, Italy. So he was a Venetian trader, and he traveled along the Silk Roads and made it out to Kublai Khan's court. And as he made it to Kublai Khan's court, Kublai Khan realized, I can use this guy. Marco Polo spoke several languages, so he kind of became Kublai Khan's right-hand man. Could do some translating and things like that. Eventually, Marco Polo went back home. Through various wars and other things that were happening, he was thrown in jail, and he wrote his stories down in a book about what he saw in China and his time spent in China. So we know Marco Polo based on his stories that he wrote down. There's a lot of people in Europe that didn't believe him. He talked about palaces and all this great stuff in China, and the people are like, the Chinese are backwards. They're uncivilized people. Well, they couldn't have been more wrong. The Chinese had had a thriving civilization for a very long time. Just so happens that most of the Europeans had never been to China, so they didn't really know what was going on there. They didn't know how advanced the Chinese truly were. So the end of Mongol rule in China. Well, all good things must come to an end, right? So Kublai Khan's armies and navies eventually suffered many humiliating defeats at huge expense of lives and equipment towards the end of his reign. So bottom line is, the Mongols weren't always successful in warfare under Kublai Khan. When you lose a war, that costs you money. On top of that, heavy spending on wars, public works, and the yuan luxuries that he loved overburdened the treasury and angered the overtaxed citizens. Remember, if you overtax the people, if you overwork the people, they will eventually react. Now, Kublai Khan died in 1294, and his successors were just inept or unqualified at ruling the dynasty. And in 1368, the Chinese rebelled, and they finally overthrew the Mongols. The Mongols were kicked out of China, and China would eventually be ruled by the Chinese again, and they established the Ming Dynasty. So the Ming Dynasty was established as the next ruling Chinese dynasty. With the fall of the Yuan dynasty really came the disintegration of the Mongol Empire in Asia. It wasn't the end of the Mongol people, but the power and dominance of the Mongols really kind of ended after their rule in China, and they broke up into much smaller units rather than having that giant, huge empire that I showed you in the previous slides. And our next topic in this unit is Japan. So Japan was on the rise, and we're going to shift over across the sea and talk a little bit more about Japan in the next part of this unit. So that brings us to our result. The line, unless you are the Mongols, from Crash Course, proves how truly unique these nomadic pastoralists were. From their ruthless tactics on the battlefield, to briefly ruling China as foreign rulers, to creating the world's largest unified land empire in history, the Mongols will be remembered as one of history's truly great empires. So that brings us to the end, folks. Our constructive response question really focused on part 1 in Temujin. Trace the development of Temujin and his empire, including background information, motivations, and military tactics used. And you should have plenty of information to handle that. His background information and motivations were really in the video. You know, he wanted to conquer the globe. He certainly wanted to conquer China, even though he never got a chance to finish either of those jobs. And we saw many of his military tactics. We talked about them in part 1. You certainly saw those in the video. So you have a lot to work with there on that question. And I will bid you adieu. So I hope you learned something here, and have a nice day.